October 14th, 2018. That was the day Sarah Jenkins died, or at least the version of her that believed in fairy tales. Standing in the pouring rain outside the gilded revolving doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel, she clutched a single garbage bag containing her entire life. Inside, her husband of 10 years was popping champagne, celebrating his promotion and his divorce in the same breath. He told the staff to escort her out like a vagrant. He thought he had won. He thought silence was weakness. But he forgot one thing. You don't fear the storm when you are the storm. And Sarah. She was just beginning to thunder. The marble floors of the Grand Meridian Hotel were cold, but not as cold as the smile on Richard Sterling's face. It was 7:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. The lobby was buzzing with high society guests arriving for the Autumn Charity Gala, an event Sarah had spent 3 months organizing for free, just as she had organized Richard's life for the past decade. But tonight, she wasn't the hostess. She was the nuisance. Richard, looking dapper in a bespoke navy tuxedo she had picked out for him, stood by the reception desk. He was the newly appointed general manager of the Meridian, a position he had chased for years. Beside him stood Tiffany Miller, the 24-year-old marketing intern, who was technically Sarah's replacement in more ways than one. "You're late," Richard said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. He didn't look at Sarah's face. He looked at her shoes. They were wet. Cheap sneakers, soaked from the walk because Richard had cancelled her Uber account an hour ago. "I signed the papers, Rick," Sarah said. Her voice was a rasp. She hadn't slept in 48 hours. "I just need the keys to the Corolla. You said I could take the old car." Richard laughed, a sharp, barking sound that signaled to the staff that this was a performance. "The Corolla, Sarah, that's a company asset. You're not company anymore. Well, frankly, you're a liability." The air in the lobby grew thick. Several bellhops men Sarah had baked cookies for during the Christmas shifts looked down at their shoes. They couldn't make eye contact. They knew what was happening. They knew Sarah had written Richard's speeches. They knew she had balanced the books when the previous manager messed up. They knew she was the architect of his success. "We had an agreement," Sarah whispered, clutching the manila envelope that contained the divorce decree. It was a no-fault divorce, but the prenup, a nasty piece of work Richard had pressured her into signing the night before their wedding, just for tax purposes, left her with exactly nothing. No alimony, no claim to his assets. "Agreements change when you breach contract," Richard sneered, stepping closer. The smell of his expensive cologne, Santal 33, made her stomach turn. "You embarrassed me, Sarah, showing up here looking like a drowned rat. At my gala security." 2 burly men in dark suits stepped forward. Sarah recognized one of them. "Dave?" she asked softly. Dave flinched. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling. Mr. Sterling's orders." "It's Ms. Jenkins," Sarah corrected, her voice suddenly steady. "Get her out," Richard commanded, waving a hand dismissively as he turned back to Tiffany, who was suppressing a giggle. "And Sarah, don't try to come back for your clothes at the house. I had the cleaners toss everything in the dumpster this morning. You left the marriage with nothing. You leave the life with nothing. That's how the real world works." This was the moment where a lesser woman would have screamed, where she would have thrown a vase, slapped his face, or begged on her knees for mercy. The entire lobby was watching rich investors, local politicians, the hotel staff. They were waiting for the breakdown. They wanted the reality TV show moment. Sarah gave them nothing. She looked at Richard. She didn't glare. She didn't cry. She looked at him with a terrifying, hollow neutrality, as if he were a smudge on a window that she would eventually wipe away. She placed the envelope on the mahogany counter. "You're right, Richard," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the silence of the lobby. "The real world is very different." She turned around. She walked past the security guards, past the staring guests, and pushed through the heavy revolving doors into the driving rain. She had $68 in her bank account. She had no car. She had no home. But as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind her, muffling the sound of Richard's cruel laughter, Sarah Jenkins made a vow. She wouldn't just survive. She wouldn't just get by. She was going to buy this building and fire him. It sounded impossible. It sounded like madness. But Sarah had one asset Richard didn't know about. He thought she was just a housewife who planned parties. He forgot that before she met him, she was a forensic accountant. She knew where the bodies were buried. She knew the Grand Meridian wasn't as profitable as it looked. And she knew Richard was skimming off the top. But she couldn't prove it. Not yet. First, she had to survive the night. 3 years later. If you walked past the Bean and Leaf coffee shop on 4th Street in Seattle, you might have seen a woman in a grey cardigan working on a battered laptop in the corner. She was there every morning at 5:30 a.m., nursing a single black coffee for 4 hours. Sarah had aged. There were silver streaks in her hair now, and fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she left New York. The first 6 months had been a nightmare. She had slept in a women's shelter for 3 weeks, then a hostel before finally landing a job doing night shift bookkeeping for a chain of auto repair shops. It wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, grease-stained work. But she saved every penny. She ate ramen. She walked everywhere. And she watched the markets. She had moved to Seattle to disappear. She needed to be far away from Richard's influence in New York. Here she wasn't Mrs. Sterling, the discarded wife. She was just Sarah, the quiet woman, who was incredibly good with numbers. Her life changed on a Tuesday, much like the one where she had been thrown out of the hotel. She was living in a crumbling apartment complex in a rougher part of the city. Her neighbor in 4B was a cantankerous old man named Tobias Finch. Most neighbors avoided him. He yelled at kids for playing too loud and smelled permanently of old books and peppermint. But Sarah noticed things. She noticed he struggled to carry his groceries up the 3 flights of stairs. She noticed his mail piling up when his arthritis flared. One rainy evening, she found him slumped in the hallway, clutching his chest. "Mr. Finch." She dropped her bag and rushed to him. "I'm fine, damn it," he wheezed, swatting at her. "Just winded." She ignored him, checking his pulse, helping him sit up and getting him water. She didn't call an ambulance because he forbade it, claiming doctors were thieves. Instead, she helped him into his apartment. It was a shock. The outside of the building was a dump, but inside, Tobias's apartment was floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves. It looked like a library from the 19th century. There were maps, ledgers, and architectural blueprints everywhere. "You're the accountant girl," Tobias grunted, settling into his leather armchair. "Sarah," she corrected, heating up a can of soup for him. "And yes, I do books." "You do books for idiots who fix transmissions," Tobias muttered. "I hear you on the phone through the walls. You're wasting your time. You caught that tax error in their inventory last week. Saved them 10 grand. They give you a bonus." Sarah paused, spoon in hand. "No. Didn't think so." Tobias eyed her. "Why do you live here?" You're too smart for this dump. I'm restarting, Sarah said simply. I lost everything. Divorce? Hostile takeover, she corrected. Tobias cackled. It was a dry, dusty sound. I like that. Hostile takeover. Over the next 6 months, an unlikely friendship formed. Sarah didn't know it, but this was her interview. Tobias Finch wasn't just an old man. He was the Tobias Finch, a real estate speculator who had made a fortune in the 80s buying distressed commercial properties and then vanished from the public eye because he hated people. He owned half the waterfront, but he lived in a dump because he liked to keep an eye on the rats. He began to test her. He'd leave complex tax documents on the table. Look at this mess, he'd grumble. My lawyer is an idiot. Sarah would glance at it. He's not an idiot, he's lazy. He missed a depreciation deduction on the warehouse in Tacoma. That's a 15% loss right there. Tobias's eyes would gleam. Then came the day the cancer took a turn. Tobias was bedridden. Sarah took care of him not for money, but because she knew what it was like to be alone. She cooked, she read to him, and she listened to his stories about business. He taught her the sterling squeeze, ironically named no relation to Richard, a method of buying debt to control a company's board. On his deathbed, Tobias grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. Don't be nice, Sarah, he rasped. Nice gets you walked on. Be accurate. Be ruthless. And never let them see the knife until it's cutting the cake. I promised Tobias. He died 2 hours later. Sarah cried. She was the only one at his funeral, aside from a bored lawyer named Arthur Penhaligon. After the service, Arthur approached her. He was a man of few words, wearing a suit that cost more than Sarah's annual salary. Miss Jenkins, Arthur said, handing her a thick envelope. Mr. Finch left instructions. He said you were the only person in 20 years who didn't ask him for money. I didn't want his money, Sarah said, wiping her eyes. He was my friend. That, Arthur said, opening the folder, is exactly why he gave you everything. Sarah stared at him. Everything. The apartment building, the warehouses in Tacoma, the portfolio. Arthur adjusted his glasses. And a specific directive regarding a holding company called Phoenix Capital. He said you'd know what to do with it. Sarah opened the folder. The numbers swam before her eyes. The portfolio wasn't just a few buildings. It was valued at $40 million. But it was the note clipped to the front that made her heart stop. It was in Tobias's shaky handwriting. Sarah. I looked into your ex-husband. He's a small fish swimming in a shark tank. You're the shark now. Go eat. Sarah looked up at the grey Seattle sky. The rain felt different today. It didn't feel cold. It felt like fuel. She turned to Arthur. Mr. Penhaligon, how fast can we liquidate the Tacoma assets? I need cash. Liquid cash? Arthur raised an eyebrow. What are you planning, Miss Jenkins? Sarah smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of the woman who baked cookies. It was the smile of the woman who had survived the storm. I'm going to New York, she said. I have a hotel to buy. New York City runs on 2 things, caffeine and the fear of irrelevance. When Sarah stepped off the jet at Teterboro Airport, she ran on neither. She ran on cold, hard calculation. It was May 2022. Almost 4 years since she had been escorted out of the Grand Meridian, like trash. The woman who stepped onto the tarmac wasn't Sarah Jenkins, the frantic housewife in wet sneakers. She was Sarah Finch Sterling. She had legally adopted Tobias's surname as a tribute, the CEO of Phoenix Holdings. She wore a cream-colored Alexander McQueen suit, tailored to within an inch of its life, and sunglasses that cost more than her old Toyota Corolla. She didn't come alone. Flanking her was Arthur Penhaligon, looking uncomfortable in the humidity, and her newly hired director of acquisitions, a man named Gavin Reed. Gavin was a former Goldman Sachs shark who had been blacklisted for being too aggressive. Sarah liked him immediately. "The intel is solid," Gavin said, as they settled into the back of a black Escalade. He handed Sarah a tablet. "The Grand Meridian is bleeding. Richard has been trying to pivot the hotel to a younger, influencer-focused crowd. He spent $4 million renovating the lobby bar into a nightclub called Vibe. It's a ghost town on weeknights, and on weekends the noise complaints are driving away the high-paying corporate guests." Sarah swiped through the charts. The numbers painted a portrait of arrogance. Revenue was down 18%. Operating costs were up 25%. "He's desperate," Sarah murmured, studying a photo of Richard from a recent Page 6 article. He looked thinner, his hairline receding, a desperate glint in his eyes. He was standing next to Tiffany, who now looked less like a bubbly intern and more like a bored, trapped trophy wife. "Who holds the debt? That's the beauty of it." Gavin grinned, showing teeth that had chewed up lesser companies. "The Meridian isn't owned by Richard. He's just the GM with equity options. The building is owned by the Abernathy Trust. Old money. They are tired of the losses. They took out a balloon loan with Deutsche Bank to cover Richard's renovations, and that loan matures in 3 months. They can't pay it. So the bank forecloses," Arthur noted. "Unless someone buys the debt," Sarah said, closing the tablet. She looked out the window as the Manhattan skyline came into view. "We don't buy the hotel, Gavin. Not yet. We buy the debt. I want to be the one Richard has to write the check to." "That's vicious," Gavin said admiringly. "Buying the debt makes you his landlord and his executioner." "Set up a meeting with the Deutsche Bank asset disposal team," Sarah ordered. "Tell them Phoenix Holdings is interested in their distressed hospitality portfolio. Offer them 85 cents on the dollar. They'll take it to get the bad loan off their books." "And Richard?" Arthur asked. "Does he know who is behind Phoenix?" Sarah smiled. It was a cold smile. "Richard never looked at the details, Arthur. That was always my job. He won't check the LLC registration until it's too late. To him, we're just another faceless investment fund." 2 weeks later, Sarah sat in a glass-walled conference room in Midtown. Across from her sat the Deutsche Bank executives. They were eager to sell. The Meridian loan was toxic. "We appreciate the offer, Ms. Finch," the lead banker said, sweating slightly. "But we have a fiduciary duty to inform the debtor that the note is being sold." "Standard procedure," Sarah said, her voice smooth. "Notify the Abernathy Trust. Notify Mr. Sterling. Tell them their mortgage has been acquired by Phoenix Holdings. Do not mention my name. Just the entity." "Understood." As she signed the papers, a transfer of $22 million, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. With the stroke of a pen, she effectively owned the ground Richard walked on. That night, she decided to see her investment up close. She didn't book a room. She booked the room. The Royal Penthouse Suite at the Grand Meridian. $12,000 a night. She arrived at 8 p.m. The doorman didn't recognize her. Her hair was different, a sleek, sharp bob instead of the messy ponytail. Her makeup was professional, her posture was regal. But as she walked into the lobby, the memories hit her like a physical blow. The smell of Santal 33 was faint but present. The spot where she had placed the divorce papers was now covered by a tacky neon sign pointing toward the Vibe nightclub. She approached the front desk. The receptionist was new, a young man with tired eyes. "Checking in for Finch," Sarah said. "Ah, yes. The penthouse." The young man typed frantically. "Welcome, Miss Finch. We have your champagne on ice." Suddenly, a voice boomed across the lobby. "Where is the ice sculpture? I asked for the swan to be facing the entrance." Sarah froze. It was Richard. He stormed out of the back office, screaming at a terrified catering manager. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled. There were bags under his eyes deep enough to carry groceries. "Mr. Sterling," the manager stammered. "The ice melted because the AC in the ballroom is broken again." "Fix it," Richard roared. "Do I have to do everything myself if the charity gala tonight is a bust? It's your head, not mine." Sarah turned slowly. She was 10 feet away from him. Richard spun around, sensing eyes on him. He looked right at her. For a second time, stopped. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Would he see her? Would he recognize the woman he had thrown out into the rain? Richard's eyes scanned her. The expensive suit, the confident stance, the Birkin bag. He saw a wealthy guest. He saw money. He didn't see his ex-wife. He put on his fake customer service smile, the one Sarah used to think was charming, but now looked like a grimace. "Good evening, madam," Richard said, stepping forward, smoothing his tie. "I hope the check-in process is going smoothly. I'm Richard Sterling, the general manager. If there's anything you need—" "I'm fine," Sarah said. Her voice was deeper, controlled. She didn't look away. Richard paused. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Have we met?" "I don't think so," Sarah lied effortlessly. "I would remember." "Of course," Richard laughed nervously. You remind me of someone. Enjoy your stay." He turned back to the catering manager and resumed screaming. Sarah took her key card. She walked to the elevator, her heels clicking on the marble. As the doors closed, she watched Richard wiping sweat from his forehead. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing in a trap, and the walls were closing in. The autumn charity gala was an irony that wasn't lost on Sarah. It was the same event she had been kicked out of 4 years ago. Tonight, she was the guest of honor, though nobody knew it yet. She sat at table 4, a prime spot she had purchased for $50,000. Next to her was Gavin Reed, who was acting the part of her bored, wealthy boyfriend. The ballroom was tacky. Richard's renovations involved too much gold leaf and purple velvet. It looked like a casino that was trying too hard. Sarah watched the room. She saw the cracks in the facade. The waiters were understaffed and running frantically. The wine was a cheaper vintage than the bottle claimed. The Vanderbilt table was empty because the real Vanderbilts had stopped coming to the Meridian years ago. Then Richard took the stage. He held the microphone with a trembling hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We have a special announcement tonight. As you know, the Meridian has always been a pillar of excellence." He trailed off as a murmur went through the crowd. A man in a grey suit had walked onto the stage and whispered something in Richard's ear. It was a process server. Sarah sipped her champagne. She had timed this. Richard's face went pale. He tried to wave the man away, but the man was insistent. He handed Richard a thick envelope. "Get off the stage." Richard hissed, his voice caught by the hot mic. A few people chuckled, thinking it was a skit. It wasn't a skit. It was the notice of default. Sarah had instructed her lawyers to accelerate the debt clause. Because Richard had failed to maintain the building's HVAC system, the broken AC in the ballroom he was in, breach of the loan covenants. Phoenix Holdings was calling in the full $22 million. Immediately, Richard tried to recover. A minor technicality, folks. Please enjoy the dinner. He practically ran off the stage. Sarah turned to Gavin. It's time. Are you sure? Gavin asked. We can let him sweat for a few days. No, Sarah said. I want to see his face when he realizes who owns him. She stood up. She wasn't wearing a mask, but tonight she wore a dress of midnight blue silk diamond earrings that caught the light and a look of absolute authority. She walked out of the ballroom and headed toward the executive offices. She knew the way. She used to bring Richard his lunch down this hallway. She found him in his office, frantically pouring a scotch. Tiffany was sitting on the sofa, scrolling on her phone, looking annoyed. Rick, they're saying the credit cards are declining at the bar, Tiffany whined. It's embarrassing. Shut up, Tiff, Richard snapped. I'm trying to think. Who the hell is Phoenix Holdings? Why are they doing this now? Because you missed a payment, Richard, Sarah said from the doorway. Richard dropped his glass. Ideally, it would have shattered, but it bounced on the carpet, spilling amber liquid everywhere. He stared at her. This time there was no crowd to distract him, no rain to obscure her face. He looked at the woman in the doorway, and the realization hit him like a freight train. Sarah, he whispered. Tiffany looked up. Who? Get out, Tiffany, Richard breathed, not taking his eyes off Sarah. Excuse me. Tiffany stood up, hands on her hips. I said, get all out, Richard screamed. Tiffany grabbed her purse and stormed past Sarah, bumping her shoulder intentionally. Sarah didn't budge an inch. Richard leaned against his desk, his face grey. Sarah, you look expensive, Sarah finished for him. She walked into the room and sat in one of the guest chairs, the chair she used to sit in, while he lectured her about spending too much on groceries. I look expensive, Richard. What are you doing here? Richard tried to muster some of his old arrogance, but it fell flat. I told you never to come back. Security. Security works for me now, Sarah said calmly. Or at least they will in about 24 hours. She tossed a folder onto his desk. It landed with a heavy thud. What is this? That is the deed of assignment, Sarah said. I own the debt, Richard. I own the mortgage. I own the over-leveraged loans you took out to build that ridiculous nightclub. I am Phoenix Holdings. Richard opened the folder. His hands shook so badly he could barely turn the pages. He read the names. Sarah Finch Sterling, CEO. Finch. Richard looked up, bewildered. The old crazy guy in 4B, you slept with him. Sarah stood up, her eyes flashing dangerous fire. Careful, Richard. You're speaking to your creditor. Tobias Finch was a genius. He taught me everything you were too stupid to learn. He taught me that business isn't about suits and parties. It's about leverage. You can't do this, Richard stammered. I have rights. The board hates you, Sarah said. I spoke to Mr. Abernathy this morning. He's relieved. He's been looking for a reason to fire you for 2 years. This default. This is his golden ticket. Richard sank into his chair. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The man who had once loomed over her like a god was now shrinking into a terrified child. Sarah, please, he said, his voice changing tone. He put on the soft, manipulative voice he used to use when he wanted her to forgive his affairs. Baby, look, We have history. I know I was harsh. I was under pressure. But we were a team once. We can be a team again. With your capital and my vision, your vision." Sarah laughed. It was a genuine laugh of disbelief. "Richard, your vision is bankrupt. You drove a historic hotel into the ground because you wanted to feel cool. And as for we," she leaned across the desk, her face inches from his, "there is no we. There is only the landlord and the tenant. And eviction notices go out tomorrow." "You're evicting me," Richard gasped. "But where will I go?" "The company apartment is part of the contract. The contract is void upon default," Sarah said, quoting the clause he had used against her regarding the Corolla years ago. "And as for where you'll go, I hear the Motel 6 by the airport is hiring night managers. You might want to update your resume." She turned to leave. "Sarah," Richard cried out, standing up. "You can't do this. I'm Richard Sterling." "Not anymore," Sarah said without looking back. "Now you're just a liability." The twist. Sarah walked out of the office, feeling a sense of closure she had chased for 4 years. She expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired. She met Gavin in the lobby. "Did you do it?" Gavin asked. "I did," Sarah said. "Initiate the foreclosure. I want him out by Friday." "There's a problem," Gavin said. His face was grim. "What?" "I just got off the phone with the Abernathy Trust lawyers," Gavin said, lowering his voice. "While you were in there, someone else made a counteroffer for the equity of the hotel. Someone who wants to pay off the debt in full." Sarah frowned. Who would want this money pit?" "A shell company called Obsidian," Gavin said. "And you're not going to believe who is backing it." "Who?" "Tiffany Miller," Gavin said. Sarah blinked. "Tiffany. The intern. She doesn't have a dime." "No," Gavin said. "But her father does. Turns out Tiffany isn't just a pretty face from nowhere. She's the estranged daughter of Marcus Blackwood." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Marcus Blackwood was a corporate raider, a billionaire known for stripping companies for parts. He was the only man in New York more ruthless than Tobias Finch had been. "Richard doesn't know?" Sarah asked. "Richard thinks she's a broke, aspiring model," Gavin said. "But she's been playing him. She's been feeding information to her father this whole time. They want the hotel so they can demolish it and build a luxury condo tower." Sarah looked back toward Richard's office. Richard was crying over his scotch, thinking Sarah was his biggest problem. He had no idea that the girl he was screaming at 5 minutes ago was actually the shark that was going to eat them all. Sarah realized with a jolt that her revenge wasn't over. If Blackwood bought the hotel, he would pay off Sarah's debt note. She would make a profit. Yes, but the hotel, the staff, Dave, the security guard, the history would be destroyed. Richard would be bailed out by Tiffany, and the cycle of mediocrity would continue. She couldn't let that happen. "Get me a meeting with Tiffany," Sarah said, buttoning her jacket. "Tonight?" "Sarah, you're playing with fire," Gavin warned. "Blackwood destroys people for sport." "Good," Sarah said, walking toward the revolving doors. "I've brought my own matches." She wasn't just fighting for revenge anymore. She was fighting for the soul of the building. And to do that, she might have to do the unthinkable, save Richard Sterling to save the hotel. Or perhaps destroy them both. The Vibe nightclub was a neon-lit tomb. It was 11 p.m., and the DJ was playing throbbing techno to an empty dance floor. A single bartender polished glasses looking bored. In the corner booth, sipping a sparkling water with the air of a queen surveying a conquered kingdom, sat Tiffany Miller. Sarah approached the booth. She didn't storm in. She walked with the fluid, dangerous grace of a predator who has spotted prey that doesn't know it's being hunted. "Cut the music," Sarah said to the DJ as she passed the booth. The DJ, intimidated by her glare, killed the volume. The silence that rushed into the room was heavy. Tiffany looked up her phone screen, illuminating a face that was no longer vapid or sweet. The mask had slipped. Her eyes were sharp, cold, and calculating. "I wondered how long it would take you," Tiffany said, not bothering to stand. "You're smarter than Richard, though that's a very low bar." Sarah slid into the booth opposite her. Marcus Blackwood's daughter, playing intern for 6 months. That's commitment to a bit. Tiffany laughed. It wasn't a giggle. It was a dry, cynical sound. "Daddy wanted the property. He tried to buy it from the Abernathy Trust 2 years ago, but they refused to sell to a developer. They wanted to preserve the legacy. So we needed the hotel to fail. If it fails, they have to sell. Richard was the perfect idiot to drive it into the ground." Sarah felt a chill. Richard was incompetent, yes, but he had been sabotaged. Tiffany had been the one whispering in his ear to build this ridiculous nightclub, to ignore the HVAC repairs, to alienate the staff. She had been the architect of his ruin from the inside. "You destroyed a 100-year-old institution just to lower the stock price?" Sarah asked. "It's just real estate, Sarah. Don't be sentimental. It's dirt and brick." Tiffany swirled her drink. "Daddy is flying in tomorrow morning. We're making a tender offer for the equity. We'll pay off your little debt note with interest, of course, and then we're bringing in the wrecking balls. Condos sell for $4,000 a square foot. Hotels are for suckers." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "So take your payout and walk away, Sarah. You beat Richard. Good for you. But you can't beat Blackwood Capital." Sarah stared at the younger woman. She saw the arrogance of inherited power. Tiffany had never built anything. She had only learned how to take. "You're right," Sarah said softly. "I can't beat Blackwood with money. You have billions." "Exactly. But," Sarah continued, standing up, "you made one mistake. You assumed Richard was the only one who could break things." Sarah turned and walked away. Tiffany called after her. "What does that mean?" Sarah didn't answer. She pulled out her phone and called Gavin. "Where are you?" "Lobby," Gavin answered. "Sarah Blackwood's legal team just filed an injunction to stop our foreclosure. They're claiming we're acting in bad faith. It will tie us up in court for months while they buy the hotel out from under us." "I know," Sarah said, stepping into the elevator. She pressed the button for the penthouse. "That's why I'm going to do something I promised myself I'd never do." "What?" "I'm going to save Richard Sterling. The devil you know." The penthouse smelled of stale scotch and defeat. Richard was sitting on the floor by the balcony, staring out at the rainy New York skyline. He had loosened his tie, and his hair was a mess. He looked like a man who had realized the universe was a joke, and he was the punchline. He didn't look up when Sarah entered. "Here to gloat," he slurred. "Go ahead. I lost the hotel. I lost the girl. I lost the reputation. It's a clean sweep." "Tiffany is Marcus Blackwood's daughter," Sarah said, dropping the bombshell without preamble. Richard froze. He turned his head slowly. "What? She played you, Rick. She encouraged the bad renovations. She pushed you to ignore the maintenance. She wanted the hotel to fail so her father could buy it cheap and demolish it." Richard stared at her, his eyes pooled and bloodshot. "No. No, Tiff. She loves me. She said I was a visionary. She thinks you're a useful idiot, Sarah said brutally. She tossed a tablet onto his lap. It showed a dossier Gavin had compiled photos of Tiffany and Marcus Blackwood at a gala in the Hamptons, emails leaked from a Blackwood server discussing Project Meridian. Richard scrolled through the photos. His face went from red to a ghostly white. The betrayal was absolute. The woman he had left Sarah for the woman he had tried to impress with his cruelty was a spy. He let out a sound, a strangled sob mixed with a laugh. I threw you out for a corporate I destroyed my life for a fraud. Yes, you did, Sarah said cold-heartedly. And now they are going to bulldoze this hotel. They're going to fire Dave. They're going to fire the chefs. They're going to erase everything you spent 10 years pretending to build. Richard looked up. What do I do? I'm finished, Sarah. You own the debt. They have the money. I'm just nothing. You have one thing, Sarah said, crouching down so she was eye level with him. You have the Class B voting shares. The Abernathy Trust gave you 5% equity as part of your compensation package. It's worthless in terms of money because the debt is so high, but it carries voting rights on the board. So, the board meets tomorrow at 9 a.m. to vote on the Blackwood buyout, Sarah explained. The Abernathy family is split. Half want the money, half want to save the legacy. If you vote with Blackwood, he gets the hotel. If you vote with me, with you. Richard frowned. But you want to foreclose. I want to convert my debt into equity, Sarah said. It's a maneuver called a debt for equity swap. If I do that, I become the majority owner. I keep the hotel standing. I keep the staff. And me, Richard asked, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. If I help you, do I get to stay? Sarah looked at him. She saw the desperation. This was the moment she could have lied. She could have promised him his job back, used him and then fired him. It's what Tobias Finch would have done. But Sarah wasn't Tobias. She was better. No, Richard, she said clearly. You don't get to stay. You're toxic. You treated people like garbage. You're fired either way. Richard flinched. Then why should I help you? Because, Sarah said, standing up and walking to the door, if you help them, you're the man who sold the Grand Meridian to be turned into condos. You're a failure and a sellout. If you help me, you're the man who went down saving the ship. You get to leave with a shred of dignity. And frankly, Rick Dignity is the only thing you have left to bargain for. She opened the door. The meeting is in the Jade Room, 9 a.m. Don't be late. She left him alone in the dark. The Jade Room was the inner sanctum of the Grand Meridian. Dark wood paneling oil paintings of dead ancestors and a long oak table that had seen more bloodletting than a battlefield. At one end of the table sat the Abernathy board, 3 elderly men and 2 women who looked like they smelled something bad. At the other side sat Marcus Blackwood. He was a terrifying figure. 60 years old, bald with eyes like flint. He wore a suit that cost more than Sarah's first house. Beside him sat Tiffany, looking professional and smug. Sarah walked in at 8:59 a.m. She was flanked by Gavin and Arthur. She wore white, a stark contrast to the dark suits in the room. It was a power move. She wasn't hiding. Ms. Finch, Marcus Blackwood said. His voice was deep, gravelly. I understand you bought the debt. Clever. I'm prepared to write you a check right now to clear it. You'll make a tidy 15% profit. Take it and go. I'm not a bank, Mr. Blackwood, Sarah said, taking her seat opposite him. I'm not looking for interest. I'm looking for the keys. The hotel is insolvent, Tiffany piped up. The debt-to-equity ratio is disastrous. The only responsible move for the board is to sell to Blackwood Capital for cash. the chairman of the board. Mr. Abernathy sighed. Miss Finch, we appreciate your interest, but Mr. Blackwood is offering $120 million, even after paying off your loan that leaves the trust with a significant profit. We have a duty to our beneficiaries. Blackwood is going to demolish the building, Sarah said. He's going to fire 400 employees. That is regrettable, Abernathy said, avoiding her eyes. But it is business. It's a done deal, Marcus growled. Let's vote. We have the majority support. Not yet, Sarah said. You're missing a shareholder. The door opened. Richard Sterling walked in. He looked different. He was clean-shaven. He wore his best suit. He wasn't slouching. For the first time in years, he looked like the man Sarah had fallen in love with a decade ago. The man who had ambition before he had greed. Tiffany rolled her eyes. Oh, please. Richard, don't embarrass yourself. Just sign the proxy over to my father. Richard walked to the table. He didn't look at Tiffany. He looked at Marcus Blackwood. You used my daughter, Marcus said, amused. And you let her. You're a weak man, Sterling. I was. Richard said, his voice steady. I was weak. I let my ego drive this place into the ditch. And I let you. He turned to Tiffany. Manipulate me. It wasn't hard, Tiffany sneered. Richard flinched, but he didn't break. He turned to the board. I hold the Class B shares. The bylaws state that in the event of a hostile takeover bid, which this is the Class B shares, carry veto power over any sale that results in a change of use for the property. The room went silent. Arthur Penhaligon. Sarah's lawyer smiled thinly. He had found that clause at 4:00 a.m. It was an obscure bylaw from 1925 intended to stop the hotel from being turned into a brothel, but it applied to condos, too. That's archaic. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. We'll sue to invalidate it. You can try, Sarah interjected, but that litigation will take years, and while you're in court, I'll be foreclosing on the debt. I will drag this hotel into bankruptcy, and your equity offer will be worthless. Marcus glared at Sarah. He realized he was in a pincer movement. Sarah held the debt. Richard held the veto. What do you want? Marcus hissed. I want to convert my debt to equity, Sarah said. I take 60% ownership of the hotel. The Abernathy Trust keeps 40%. You walk away. And why would the board agree to that? Abernathy asked. We get no cash. You get to keep the hotel, Sarah said. And you get a new CEO who actually knows how to run a business. I've already secured a partnership with the Rosewood Group to rebrand and manage the property. My projections show profitability in 18 months. She slid a new business plan across the table. It was brilliant. It cut the Vibe nightclub, restored the classic jazz bar, and focused on high-end corporate retreats. It was the plan Richard should have written. The board murmured. They were old money. They hated the idea of condos. They loved the idea of legacy. I vote for Ms. Finch's proposal, Richard said clearly. You can't, Tiffany shrieked. Richard, think about it. My father can destroy you. He'll make sure you never work in this town again. Richard looked at Tiffany. He smiled a sad, broken smile. I'm already finished, Tiff. I'm doing the one thing I can't be fired from. He looked at Sarah. I vote for Sarah. Mr. Abernathy looked around the table. The veto stands. The sale to Blackwood is blocked. We will entertain the motion for the debt for equity swap. Marcus Blackwood stood up. His face was purple. "You're making a mistake. You're trusting a housewife and a failure." "She's not a housewife," Richard said softly. "She's the smartest person in the room." Marcus stormed out, his security team trailing him. Tiffany paused at the door, shooting a look of pure venom at Richard. "You're pathetic." "Maybe," Richard said. "But I'm right." The meeting adjourned. The lawyers were signing the paperwork. Sarah Finch Sterling was now the owner of the Grand Meridian. She walked out into the hallway. Richard was waiting by the elevator holding a cardboard box. He had packed his office. Sarah stopped. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a strange hollowness. "You did good today, Richard," she said. "I didn't do it for you," Richard said, staring at the elevator numbers. "I did it because, well, I couldn't let her win. Not after I found out she was laughing at me the whole time." "Fair enough." The elevator arrived. Richard stepped in. He held the door open for a second. "So," he said, "this is it. I'm homeless, jobless, and single." "You still have the Corolla," Sarah said. Richard laughed. It was a genuine laugh this time. "Yeah, I guess I do. Irony is a bitch, isn't it?" "Richard," Sarah said. She reached into her purse. She pulled out a check. It was for $50,000. "What is this?" Richard asked, staring at it. "Severance," Sarah said. "You were a terrible husband and a bad manager. But you voted right today. Take it. Go somewhere new. Start over. And for God's sake, read the contracts next time." Richard looked at the check. His eyes welled up. He wiped them quickly. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry. About everything." "I know," Sarah said. "Goodbye, Richard." The doors closed. Richard Sterling was gone. Sarah turned around. She looked down the long marble hallway of the hotel she now owned. She saw Dave, the security guard, walking towards her. "Miss Jenkins?" Dave asked, looking confused. "I heard rumors. Is it true? Are we closing?" Sarah smiled. She took a deep breath. The air smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers. The Santal 33 was gone. "No, Dave," she said. "We're not closing, and it's Ms. Finch now, but you can call me Sarah." "Okay, Sarah." Dave smiled, relieved. "Welcome back." "It's good to be back." 6 months later. December 20. 22. The Grand Meridian Hotel didn't just survive. It had been reborn. The garish purple velvet of the Vibe nightclub was gone, replaced by the rich dark mahogany and emerald leather of the Tobias Lounge, where thumping techno music once rattled the walls. A live jazz trio now played softly in the corner. The air didn't smell of cheap cologne and desperation anymore. It smelled of beeswax polish, fresh white lilies, and money. Real money. Sarah walked through the lobby at 6:00 p.m. She wore a charcoal wool coat and boots that made a solid, authoritative sound on the marble. She wasn't rushing. She moved with the calm, terrifying assurance of a woman who owned every square inch of the building, from the sub-basement laundry to the penthouse spire. "Good evening, Ms. Finch," Dave the doorman said, tipping his cap. He had a new uniform, one with gold braiding that Sarah had commissioned herself. "Cold night, Dave," Sarah said, pausing. "Make sure the valets have the heat lamps running, and tell the kitchen to send a pot of hot cocoa to the security booth. I don't want you freezing out here." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you, ma'am." Dave beamed. Under Richard, asking for a coffee break was a fireable offense. Under Sarah staff retention was at 98%. Sarah walked to the reception. The lobby was bustling, but it wasn't the influencers or the party kids anymore. It was senators, CEOs, and yes, the Vanderbilts had returned. Mrs. Vanderbilt was currently checking in her corgi yapping happily in a carrier. Sarah watched from a distance. She didn't need to intervene. She had hired a new general manager, a woman named Eleanor, who was 60 years old, sharp as a tack, and had been fired by Richard 5 years ago for being too old. Sarah had rehired her on day one. She took the private elevator up to the executive suite. The office that had once been Richard's, filled with his golf trophies and framed photos of himself, was unrecognizable. It was minimalist now. A large desk, a wall of monitors displaying real-time financial data, and a single portrait on the wall, an oil painting of an old man in a cardigan reading a book. Tobias Finch. Gavin Reed was waiting for her, sitting on the sofa with a glass of 18-year-old scotch. "You're late," Gavin teased. "I was about to drink your share." "I was checking the linen count on the 3rd floor," Sarah said, hanging up her coat. "We were short on towels last week. I wanted to make sure it didn't happen again." "You're the CEO of a hospitality group, Sarah. You don't need to count towels." "Details matter, Gavin," she said, pouring herself a water. "Richard forgot the details. That's why he's in Ohio." Gavin chuckled and tossed a folder onto the coffee table. "Well, the details are paying off. The Q4 numbers are in. We're up 220% year over year. The debt-to-equity swap is complete. The bank loves you. In fact, Deutsche Bank called. They want to know if you're interested in buying a distressed resort in Aspen." Sarah picked up the report. The numbers were beautiful. They were orderly, logical, and undeniably green. "Aspen," she mused. "Maybe, but not yet. I want to stabilize this ship first." "There's something else," Gavin said, his tone shifting. He pulled a crumpled envelope out of his pocket. "This came for you. No return address, but it's postmarked from Cleveland." Sarah froze. She recognized the handwriting. It was loops and sharp angles, Richard's handwriting. She took the envelope. She hadn't spoken to him since the day in the elevator. "Do you want me to shred it?" Gavin asked. "No," Sarah said. "I need to read it." She opened the letter. It was written on cheap, lined notebook paper. "Sarah, I'm writing this from the break room of the Holiday Inn Express off I-90. I'm the night shift manager here. It's not the Meridian. The coffee is terrible and the ice machine is always broken. But the work is honest. I used the $50,000 you gave me. I didn't buy a car. I paid off my credit cards. For the first time in 20 years, I have zero debt. I live in a small apartment. It's quiet. I saw the article in Forbes last week. The Phoenix of Fifth Avenue. You look good in the photo. Strong. I realized something when I looked at it. You were always the strong one. I was just loud. I'm sorry I threw you out in the rain. I'm sorry I didn't see you. Thank you for not destroying me when you had the chance. You're a better operator than I ever was. Sincerely, Rick." Sarah stared at the paper. She expected to feel anger or perhaps triumph. She waited for the surge of dopamine that comes with winning. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a quiet, settling peace. The ghost of Richard Sterling, the monster who had haunted her nightmares, the voice that told her she was worthless, was gone. In his place was just a guy named Rick working a night shift in Ohio. He wasn't a villain anymore. He was just a memory. "Well?" Gavin asked. "Is he begging for money?" "No," Sarah said, folding the letter and placing it in her desk drawer. "He's thanking me." "That's a twist," Gavin snorted. "And what about our other friend, the heiress?" "Tiffany." Sarah walked to the window looking out at the city lights. Her father cut her off. Gavin said with grim satisfaction. After the Meridian deal fell through, Marcus Blackwood lost face with his investors. He blamed her. He fired her from the family trust. Last I heard, she's facing an SEC investigation for insider trading regarding another deal. She's being sued by 3 different contractors. She wanted to play the game, Sarah said softly. She didn't realize the game has penalties. It was a complete victory. The board was cleared. The enemies were scattered. Sarah turned away from the window. Gavin, invite the Aspen team for a meeting next Tuesday. Let's look at that resort. Gavin grinned, raising his glass. That's the shark I know. Later that night, around 11 p.m., the hotel was quiet. Sarah put on her coat. She didn't take the elevator to the garage where her driver was waiting. Instead, she walked out the front revolving doors. It was raining again, a cold, biting New York drizzle. Dave the doorman moved to open an umbrella for her, but she raised a hand. It's okay, Dave. I don't mind. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. She stood in the exact spot where she had stood 4 years ago. She closed her eyes and remembered. She remembered the water soaking through her cheap sneakers. She remembered the humiliation burning her cheeks. She remembered the garbage bag in her hand. She remembered feeling like the world had ended. She opened her eyes. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the revolving doors. She saw a woman in a $3,000 coat. She saw the owner of a $200 million property. But more importantly, she saw a woman who was no longer afraid of the cold. Tobias had told her to be ruthless, and she had been. But she had also learned something Tobias never did, Mercy. She had saved the hotel, saved the staff, and in a way saved Richard from his own delusions. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a creator. Sarah took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the wet city air. She turned her collar up against the wind. A taxi splashed by, honking its horn. The city was loud, chaotic, and aggressive. It was a shark tank. Sarah smiled. "Swim," she whispered to herself. She turned and walked back through the golden revolving doors of her hotel, leaving the storm outside where it belonged. And that is the story of Sarah Jenkins, a woman who was thrown to the wolves and returned leading the pack. She proved that the ultimate revenge isn't destruction, it's success. She took the bricks her ex-husband threw at her and built an empire. I want to know what you think. Was Sarah too kind to Richard in the end? Should she have let him hit rock bottom, or was giving him that check the ultimate power move? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this story inspired you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel, and subscribe for more true-to-life dramas about betrayal, business, and justice. I'll see you in the next video.